In this section, we're going to touch on the general philosophy of the Michigan offense in 2021. We're also going to look at how they use their personnel and how we define their personnel before we get into specific formations, motions, and then ultimately into the concepts that made their offense so successful in 2021. So the first major thing that Michigan does a great job of that I think is really relevant for high school coaches is they create a wide variety of looks. They run empty 10 personnel, 11 personnel, 12 personnel, and even the 13 personnel looks out of a variety of personnel groupings. So what I mean by that is they'll line up in 10 personnel looks, say a 2x2 open, okay, like we see here, out of 11 personnel. The other thing that they'll do is they'll go the opposite way. They'll create looks that would you traditionally see with 12 and 21 personnel, and they'll run those out of their 11 personnel offense to get different athletes in different locations that create problems for the defense based on how they would normally adjust that 21 or 12 personnel look. Now, in terms of Michigan's base personnel, they really spend a ton of their time in both 11 and 12 personnel, and they'll run a lot of formations out of those. So I have the Y here as Eric All, a guy that they use in a ton of different roles as their kind of base guy, their Y receiver, Y tight end. In 11 personnel. When they go to 12 personnel, and I refer to it as 12 and 13 personnel because they don't really use a traditional fullback. All of their tight end players are really true tight ends, great blockers, but more tight end bodies, tight end athleticism, and used more like a traditional tight end. Even when they use them like a fullback, a lot of their play actions and stuff, you probably wouldn't ask a fullback type body to run those type of plays. So here's an example. They'll line up in a 10 personnel look out of 11 personnel. They can obviously move the Y, whether it's the trips. They can motion the Y down to really, really late create a more traditional 11 personnel look, so like a tray set here, or motion them back to a twins to create another gap. The other thing that they'll do is they'll use this guy in motion at the snap as kind of a peel player. And we'll go through a lot of those concepts. But again, they're creating extra gaps using that Y player. And then they'll get into their, kind of base 11 personnel stuff. Move this guy around, again, tons of different locations for their wide receiver. But then what they'll do is they'll move receivers to create looks that you traditionally see out of, say 21 or 12 personnel. For example, by going with a condensed split here from the X. Traditionally, you'd look at this, and say, hey, that's very similar to, say, like a flank formation where you might have, this guy as your H, okay? Or as I denoted it, actually breaking this down, always having the H on, so the Y is always off. Okay, very, very similar look. Michigan will actually run that out of their 12 personnel. They'll run this exact same alignment, okay? And then, they'll run that exact same alignment again out of 11 just by putting a receiver into that spot. So subtle little changes, but really affects, hey, if you're saying, hey, when we get this wing, now we're going to say, okay, well, is it a wing with the X receiver? Is it a wing with the H? Is it a wing created by motion? Is it all the way to, a tight bunch weak? Are they motioning into that, motioning out of that? It becomes really, really tough to defend. Where is the Y? Where are the more receiver type bodies in those tight stacks and tight bunches? They'll do the same thing, for example, by putting the Y on over here and then getting into a tight bunch or compressed bunch set to the field. Again, creating extra gaps, creating leverage for these receivers. Where, again, normally if you were seeing this look, you'd be seeing multiple tight ends. But in the Michigan offense, you're going to see it with a ton of speed players on the field as well out of that 11 personnel. Then they'll do the same thing out of their 12. So they'll take the W out, bring in their H, and now you'll get a ton of the, more traditional 12 personnel formations, whether it's an ace set like that, whether they get into a flank trips, whether they get into, a flank flip where it's more like a tight stack, where the on-the-ball player is, slightly separated from the offensive tackle and the Y is off there. Obviously, they'll get into, again, the tight bunches out of those looks. So, again, the type of look is really, really challenging here because you're not just seeing, typically you would see this type of look and you'd have one personnel group, whereas with Michigan, these might be 3 receivers. You might get the Y and the H. There might be 3 tight ends there. You might get the nub tight end away, right, in the tight bunch, and now it's the Y. So then you get a lot of these different looks, which creates, almost lulls the defense into a false sense of security. They're seeing a lot of the same looks, but simply by changing who this player is, whether it's the Y or like we had before, whether it's an 11 personnel look, it really, really changes the defense's response to those formations. The last thing, which I think is super relevant, is they'll still play empty out of the exact same personnel. So you'll get, again, back to 11. Okay, you'll have their Y typically, and they'll change based on the type of empty they're playing. Okay, but you'll get sometimes the tailback as the 3 strong. Sometimes they'll bring the X over, and you'll get the tailback as the wide receiver in the boundary, and they'll load up the 3 receivers to the field. Sometimes you'll get the Y at 3 strong and the tail at 2 weak. Again, all depends on what kind of route concepts they want to run, but they do a great job of staying in that 11 or 12 personnel grouping, sometimes getting into 13, bringing either an extra offensive lineman or a 3rd tight end off the bench to create extra blockers. But they do a great job of doing all these different sets out of traditional 11 and 12 personnels. In terms of their heavy personnel stuff, again, W is going to come out, H is going to come in first. Okay, and then you'll often see them also bring in what we'd call the U tight end. Okay, so then they'll get into some traditional 13 personnel stuff. U and the H being on the line of scrimmage. You got that single receiver. And again, they'll move this Y around. Often when they're in this stuff, the back is in the pistol. But you'll get the flank look. You'll get the gun far or gun near look from that fullback, changing sides of the formation. They love to bring the jet out of this. Again, we'll talk more about this specifically when we get to formations. Okay, but they're always looking to create down blocks, whether that's a zone down block where the running back can either hit it front side or cut it back, or a gap scheme down block where you're going to get power, duo, Y counter looks where they're trying to overload off of that down block, pull around, as old school as it gets from a football standpoint. So I think one of the great things they do is be multiple in their formations, multiple in their alignments and adjustments out of those formations, and doing that out of consistent personnels, moving guys in and around in those formations to create really challenging looks to defend.